Thanks so much for coming. I'm Steve Gray. I chair the P&G Alumni Association in the UK, and our purpose is to help former employees to stay in touch with each other and network for business purposes, and also to raise money for good causes. And we've teamed up once again with Anne and the CMI to put on tonight's event, and delighted that Anne helps us to do that. She too is a P&G alum and had a stellar career, as many of you may well recall, working in Germany, Egham and Brooklands before holding senior positions at companies like Mars and Boots and Yale. And you may not know this, but Anne has not one, but 5 honorary degrees. She's a published author, regular columnist in the Sunday Times, and spokeswoman for modern working practices. So thank you, Anne, and the team for hosting. And as I'm sure Anne will explain, we are under a little bit of time pressure. Delighted that Greg has been able to squeeze us in between other media appointments, and that's forced us to bring things forward a little bit. But Greg, too, is a P&G alum. He said that P&G was his first proper job. And then he went to work for another P&G alumni, Richard Harpin, who many of you will know, who recently sold HomeServe, the company that he founded, for $4 billion. So another connection there. Now, then Greg, of course, went on to be the founder of Octopus Energy Group, one of the biggest energy and technology companies in the world. Launched in 2016, it now has 10 million retail customers worldwide, and in less than a decade has risen from a tech challenger to the largest energy supplier in the UK, operating a £7 billion renewables portfolio, one of the largest in Europe. Greg is a serial entrepreneur, as I'm sure that we will hear. He's built and sold a number of successful businesses before Octopus, and also an angel investor in a wide range of startups. And Greg was also awarded the CBE for services to the energy industry in 2024. So thanks so much, Greg, for giving us your time. I'm going to hand over to Anne, who will host the rest of the evening.
So thank you, everybody. As I said, or as Steve referenced, we're under a bit of time pressure. I think it's quite exciting. Greg is going to disappear promptly at 1940. Around the corner, a motorbike awaits. And he's going to be whisked, James Bond-like, through the traffic to a secret location where he's going to talk about secret things, right?
Not quite. I mean, it's going to be broadcast on live TV. So not that secret, no. but great, tremendous fun.
Yeah. Tremendous fun. And he doesn't know what he's going to talk about yet because, as he was telling me, nobody else does either because it's about tomorrow's budget, right? So, and things. So, but this is about Greg. And my first question is, Greg, give us the highlights and lowlights of your career journey to date.
Wow, that's a great question. By the way, I don't know any of the questions in advance, right? And I am very sorry to be rushing off. Originally, I planned to stay around and get hammered with you all. So I'm genuinely sorry about that. But if you're still going in about 2.5 hours, right, I'll be back. Right. You know what? I think the single thing that's maybe proudest, probably therefore the biggest highlight, was when Al Gore, an investment fund he started, invested in our business. And we did this, every week we do something we call family dinner, where we get the entire company together on a Zoom call. We've got 11,000 employees across, I don't know, 20 or 30 countries. And so it's a big call, but we do it every week religiously since we very first started. And we arranged a special family dinner. And we didn't tell anybody, any of the team, what was happening. And honestly, so first of all, when you arrange a special all-company meeting on Zoom, turns out they all think they're getting fired. So it was very good expectation setting. But then I thought loads of them would be too young to know who Al Gore was. So I literally had to talk about him and introduce him in this way that kind of said what a climate hero he was, as well as being a massive figure in politics. But then he was on the Zoom, but with his camera turned off and with a false name. So then I introduced him to the team, and the screen exploded in emojis. Like, there were people basically crying in the chat panel, crying on the video snippets. And it was genuinely the proudest moment. There were two to rival it, both of them similarly family dinners. One was when we first became a unicorn, and the first time we took investment at a valuation over $1 billion. And that was special because a load of our early team had joined us, really giving up alternative opportunities for companies people had heard of to come and work in a startup. And the bit where you promised them that that equity may one day be worth something came true. And it meant the world to deliver on that promise. And the last one, where some of you may have come across a bloke called Idris Elba, who is apparently, I don't watch movies, I genuinely was very, I'd heard the name, I had no idea who he was. But we ended up building a wind farm with him in Sierra Leone. And then he joined Family Dinner. And I can't tell you that if Al Gore got a lot of love hearts,
Oh, yes.
yeah, the reactions were less appropriate for Idris. So, anyway.
Yes, I've seen the effect he has on people. So, okay, those are all highlights. I'm going to ask you about failure later, but was there one low light?
There was an amazing moment. A few years ago, there was something we called the energy crisis in Europe. And essentially what happened was after the pandemic, the wholesale cost of energy roughly doubled or trebled. And then Russia invaded Ukraine. At one point, the wholesale cost of energy was 15 times normal. Now, we buy our energy in advance, and we normally buy about 5 billion a year. So we've committed about 5 billion pounds of money to buying energy. And suddenly the price of energy goes up 15x. So we've got a 75 billion pound forward commitment. And at the time, our company was, 6 or 7 years old. And I remember looking at that, and your first thought is, it's along those lines, but with more swear words. And but then there was genuinely that, and I think this is really important. For every single low light, I think there's always been, you look at it from a different angle, and you suddenly realize it's not bad. So in that case, I remember thinking, hang on, in every one of our rivals, someone is looking at the same thing. And we are a stronger, a more efficient, better capitalized, better run, more agile business than any of them. We've got the deepest pocketed investors. This is actually a huge opportunity. And it took about 24 hours, maybe 72, to go from kind of just looking down the hole to absolutely kind of feeling, that phrase, in crisis there's opportunity.
Yeah.
If this is the biggest ever crisis, it's also the biggest opportunity. And I think as a result, we were obviously talking to our investors very closely about what was happening. I remember saying to them, right, they were all worrying. And it's like, this is not the time to worry. This is the time to get your checkbooks out. And we had a absolutely great conversation there. Obviously, relentlessly looking after customers through a tough time. But from a sort of corporate perspective, it was a transformative opportunity.
Yeah, so that is turning into an opportunity. Look for the silver lining. Basically.
It wasn't, and that's why we were able initially to buy. There's a company called Avro that went bust with 800,000 customers. Then Bulb, which had about 1.5 million, and was allegedly going to cost the UK taxpayer up to 6 billion to bail out. And we bailed it out for zero and saved it and built our business hugely. And then we did another one when we bought Shell's energy business. And all of those were really a result of that insight.
That's amazing. So, okay, how would you describe your own leadership style? I mean, obviously, there's family dinners, there's seeing opportunity in crisis. How would you describe it? What's important to you, values-wise and behavior-wise?
Yeah, so I think we're a company run on culture, not on process. And by the way, I learned that both positive and negative from P&G. I got a lot of insights. And I think on the culture side, for example, we don't have a mission statement, but every one of our employees, I think, could tell you the mission in their own words. And it's kind of more deeply meant. And I think we use things like family dinner. Every week, family dinner is reinforcing what matters to us. And that enables us to have a very decentralized culture because everyone knows what matters. Everyone knows what we highlight. Then they can make decisions without having to continually kind of either work through a list of KPIs or without having to kind of, take PowerPoints up to management all the time. They can just get on with it. And I think particularly because we wanted to scale fast. So we started the business when I was in my mid-40s. And I knew it was going to be my last real chance to do a big one. And that meant that it had to be designed from day one to be able to go very big, very fast. The other bit is when you're taking on regulated incumbents, you have to get big before they either get good or get aggressive. And I think, it was the race to scale, a bit like in the budget airlines, was really important to us. I guess the other one is, and it's something I've seen every entrepreneur, I think, is everyone that I deal with anyway, is relentless positivity. So Steve mentioned Richard Harpin. If you know Richard Harpin, the one thing is, he's always positive. I've literally never seen him lose his temper, never seen him get angry, never seen him look stressed. Simon Rogerson, the founder of Octopus Investments, our first investor, similarly, any time you're dealing with him, that relentless positivity is a driver. And I think spreading that culture is really important.
Yes, okay. More important than process and putting that at the heart of what you do. More important than mission statements.
It's funny because I love P&G, but also the relentless process is something that people will. Some people must love it because otherwise it wouldn't be there. But people complain about it and talk about it and analyze it a lot. And simultaneously, someone at P&G said, like it was Drucker that said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And honestly, process is the scraps off the bottom of the breakfast plate.
Well, okay, we both were at P&G. What are some of the good things you took from that experience? You said you loved it.
Well, one of them was that, which is learning how do you kind of look, because all process appears to be something that one individual or department create in order to get other individuals or departments to make their lives easier or more convenient. And it's usually introduced well-meaningly, but it doesn't half balloon. And I think if you've seen what happens when there's a lot of it, it really helps you be militant with your teams whenever they go, but just this little bit of process. You're like, no, we're getting rid, right? And I think that's helpful, actually. But on culture, there's one thing I think it's well known that we don't have an HR department.
Yep.
But interestingly, that was taught to me by P&G's HR department. Dennis Schuler was head of HR when I worked at Brooklands, and he was utterly brilliant. And he relentlessly talked about teaching managers to manage. And I think all we've done is taken that example and removed the last kind of piece of the puzzle. But that was huge from P&G, this relentless focus on building a team. And I remember how much that mattered.
And you don't outsource it to HR, it's the line manager's job.
Exactly.
That's your job.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that was all P&G. That is 100% P&G learning. And I think, I don't know how long we'll sort of be able to carry on without an HR department. I think when we went from 10 to 100 people, 100 to 1,000, 1,000 to 10,000, we still haven't done it. It's going all right.
Well,
and we still want to. Pardon?
It would seem so. I guess.
Yeah, well, we're one of the top 10 employers in most of, not always, but in most lists. And so it's genuinely really interesting to me to look on it as an experiment rather than a religion.
Yeah, no, I think it's really fascinating. And I agree with you about P&G. It was the line manager's job. That's one of the things that we say at CMI is most companies do not invest in management and leadership. Actually, 82% of people promoted into managerial positions get no training in management and leadership.
That's really interesting, because one thing you have to do in this scenario is we have to train people in management.
Yeah.
We have to train them in leadership. We have to ensure that they are good managers and leaders as they grow. And that is, otherwise it wouldn't work. Yep. And it's quite interesting. By the way, the BBC did this article, which was, it was headlined, "My £1 billion company has no HR department." And it was the most read article on BBC Business that year, I think. The interesting was, there was a lot of discussion of it on social media. 97% of it was positive. Story after story about kind of where HR departments were. 3% was very, very critical, and that was HR people. And I realized that it wasn't meant to be really about HR, because I think if you built a company with an HR function, so you haven't built your team from the beginning where we have, it's absolutely pivotal. And it doesn't mean that people aren't important. In fact, it means they're so important, we give it to line managers. Yeah. But it's not a criticism of HR, to be clear.
Yeah, and P&G had an HR department, not a very big one for the size of the company. Yeah. But we believe at CMI that a lot of things that are, in many cases, given to HR people should, in fact, be done by good line managers. So what did you leave behind from P&G?
Well, I talked about process a minute ago. One of my formative memories as I think as an assistant brand manager at P&G, it might even be a brand assistant, I can't remember. Anyway, was trying to get sign-off on pack copy, which anyone who's worked in marketing at P&G or close to it will recognise. And I think we had to have between 7 and 11, I can't remember, a lot of signatures. And by the end, it was really interesting. You started out with stuff you really cared about. Right? This was great copy. It was going to inspire people to buy our products to improve their lives. But by the end of it, I just want a signature. And I remember turning up at the office as a hard-pressed lawyer who the last thing they want to see is yet another brand assistant turning up with yet another version of the 18th version of the copy. And by the end, honestly, I just didn't care what was on it. And I remember realizing that everything you read, like when you read stuff like Daniel Pink's books on motivation, the inherent motivation is quite easily lost if you have all these kind of proxy processes. And so, for example, when our chief marketing officer turned up at our company, we were much smaller, we had about 70,000 customers. So six or seven, eight years ago. But she came from a very large company. She said, where do I get sign-off for copy?
Stuff, yeah.
And I said, well, you're the CMO, you do it. And she said, yeah, but what about legal? What about compliance? What about? And I said, are you trying to say anything illegal? Right? If you're sailing that close to the wind, you probably shouldn't do it. But either way, if you want to speak to a lawyer or compliance or anyone else, you can. But the responsibility is on you, as opposed to essentially, because I remember one of my greatest achievements at P&G was getting, I got spelling mistakes through on 2 packs. And I was really proud of it, because to get that through all those signatures kind of wasn't. But so,
do you remember what they were?
It was Pantene intensive conditioners. I can't remember the words that we got wrong, but it was brilliant. The ingredients were correct. Okay. But anyway, but the interesting was that turning it around. So instead of saying, look, something once went wrong, so now we have to have all these signatures, it's you're in charge. If you're not sure, please go and get advice. Yeah. And then when you're comfortable, you sign it off. But it probably reduces the amount of sign-off by, a factor of 10. Well,
and it increases the speed at which you can get things done, and probably the agility as well, right?
It totally does, yeah.
Yeah. So, well, you are, of course, undeniably a disruptor. You talked about competing with incumbents. What is the difference, you think, in the mindset of a disruptor versus an incumbent?
Just before I answer, I'm so sorry about this. I should have said this on P&G. But I got so many incredible experiences out of P&G, including people I know and love and still work with today. But there was one really big thing I took out of, which leads into answering that, I think, which was instead of, I think a lot of companies would have whatever products they were going to make, and then they'd try and apply, like marketing would be just a pretty wrapper, right, or a bland statement on any old stuff.
Yeah.
And bit by bit, you were relentlessly trained in this idea that if you really understood your customers, you could work out what you wanted to be able to sell to them, what you wanted to market to them. And then you had to go and make that product real, and you relentlessly actually had to deliver it. I remember, we could not get a product released unless it was better than rivals and met whatever claims you wanted to make about it. Yeah. And then you would make the advertising that made those claims. Yeah. And I think reverse that process, where you kind of reversed what a lot of companies do in product development and marketing, is fundamental. So when we built our company, it was like, really getting to know customers and what will they want from, I'll call it an energy company, but really a service provider that is their third biggest outgoing. And if we work out what they will want from that, and then we build the company that will deliver it, and then we do the marketing at the end, it was exactly,
So it's the relentless focus on getting the customer.
Totally.
Figuring out what the customer wants.
Yeah, and there's a real I think there's so often a lack of imagination, and once companies become distant from customers, there's lack of imagination. Because in our case, nobody wants to buy electrons or gas molecules off us. They want to heat their homes. They want to fill, if they've got electric cars, they want to fill them with electricity for driving. And actually, when you really think hard about what they're getting at the end, you change the product you give them. So, for example, you don't care about getting electrons. What you want is driving, obviously as cheaply as possible. So if we can find ways to put electricity in your car cheaper by doing it at certain times and automating it, that's compelling. The other one is no one phones us up about volts and kilowatts. They phone us up about typically about money, and understanding that if you're open and transparent with money, people will trust you and relax a lot more than if you try and be evasive. And so you've got a lot of service industries have become very good at obfuscating and hiding all the money stuff. They hide the prices. They hope you won't notice. When they write, when there's a price rise, you'll get an 18-page letter saying, boring, tedious news about your account not worth opening. And then 9 pages in, it will say, oh, and by the way, prices are going up 20%. And I think, in fact, it won't be that clear. And I think by being, for example, understanding the degree of stress people will get in our market, and that by being as clear and transparent as we can be, that's not about electrons and molecules. It's about literally their ability to have a less stressful life, and we can do that.
Yeah. Well, so, okay, and what you're saying is, as a disruptor, you do that.
I think as a disruptor, first of all, there's an academic definition of disruption. And because I don't like the phrase, it sounds like you're being chaotic or kind of deliberately destructive.
Move fast and break things.
Yeah, and the academic definition of disruptor is that in mature companies or mature industries, companies relentlessly have more bells and whistles so they can increase the price. And eventually, that opens up a big enough gap that you can redefine a simpler service and deliver it cheaply enough that you'll be able to steal market share from those companies. So it's like, for example, it's what Budget Airlines did so brilliantly against the incumbent airlines. And so, in our case, it's not so much about, the incumbents hadn't had many bells and whistles, but they'd relentlessly obfuscated prices. They'd relentlessly tried to hide prices from loyal customers so they could get higher margin. Entirely understandable. If you're optimizing against, maximizing the value of your existing customers. And also they had built big bloated organizations. So you end up with big bloat. For example, you try and hike the prices of your customers. And then if they phone you up, you'll haggle with them to keep them. And then half of them will leave. So you'll then go to a price comparison site to try and refill your pool with some loss-making customers who will then try and go through that cycle again on. And that's a very expensive cycle. And so our big disruption was we said, look, if we can be operationally efficient through technology and deliver better service, we can provide a better value long-term proposition so that we don't get the churn, which means we don't have all the costs associated with that, so we can cut our prices further. Build a brand that gives brand loyalty and a service that means you tell your friends about it. And it's a cycle a bit like that. And it means I think we have a 9% churn rate in year one, whereas rivals have 45% or thereabouts. And I think that the economics of that mean that, because I often have to remind our team, we're not doing this because we're nice people, although to be clear we are. But this cycle works, but it would be very hard for an incumbent to go to it, because in doing so, they'd have to go through a period when they're cutting prices for loyal customers, which will harm them before they've got the benefit of the better brand. And so I think that's probably the disruptive view on our sector.
Yeah, and then if they cut the prices, then they have to lay off a bunch of people, and then that eats into the culture because people fear for their jobs, and you start this cycle of anything but positivity.
Yeah, and as I said, so it's our job to get big before they got good. So some of them are going through those cycles, or indeed have done. And definitely the standards in our sector have improved dramatically, and I think that's probably a good thing.
Have you played a role in that, do you think?
Yeah. I mean, I don't really arrogant about it, but I think that growth from zero to market leader in energy retail has forced a new form of competition where service, reputation, and behaviour are important. The other was we realised it was that obfuscating pricing was bad for consumers, also bad for competition, because there's no competition if people can't see prices. And so we lobbied very hard for the energy price cap, which in the UK was a measure that was introduced to essentially limit back book pricing. And by doing that, it forces companies to be more efficient at the front book. And I think that was something we helped drive because it was the right thing for customers, but it also made it more possible to compete against them.
Well, let's talk a little bit about net zero. We just, I have to wave this around, released a report. It's on our website. We launched sustainability qualifications. This is how managers and leaders can help get to net zero. What we found, a couple of interesting things. First, there's a very big say-do gap, right? So 3/4 of managers say, our company says sustainability is very important, but, over a third of them say, but we have no idea how to get there. And then also 80% of managers say, I need training on this stuff. So what do you think? What's the role of business in helping, us to get there? What do you think the role of business should be? Are you in agreement with Prince William, who says, come on, pull your finger out, try harder? Or, what do you think about that? What's the role of business versus the role of the customer?
Yeah, so first of all, I think, look, climate change is real. and it's scary. I was sat next to the CEO of a big oil company at a dinner recently, and the guy on the other side actually asked him about climate change. And yeah, the world's got this 1.5 degree target, right? And the big oil guy, without hesitating, just said, look, 1.5's dead. He said, we're planning on 2.75. And the guy said, well, what does that mean? And without blinking, the CEO said, it means 6 meters of sea level rise. And that is probably roughly what we're currently baking in with, our current economy, right? Now, 6 meters of sea level rise, well, it's 20 feet. It doesn't happen overnight. One of the challenges with a lot of climate stuff is, this is pre-programmed. Like, the atmosphere is currently 1.5 degrees warmer. The stuff we're doing means we get 2.75 or whatever. It'll take a long time to take that heat out of the atmosphere. But while that heat is there, we're going to be melting, polar ice, in fact, glaciers and everything around the world for as long as that heat is there. And so it's just utterly inevitable. Now, today, we see that, sea levels are, I don't know, maybe a centimetre higher than they were a decade ago or whatever. It doesn't feel that bad and that unmanageable. But we have to recognise that, we need to reverse what we're doing to have any way of preventing, for example, 6 meters. I think the other thing is that the impacts are chaotic. So we already see more extreme weather events of all kinds of types, and sometimes truly destructive, incredibly financially expensive, but expensive human terms, climate events around the world. And again, we're locking in many decades of that. So first of all, this is real, and just because it's inconvenient, it hasn't gone away. I think you asked about the roles of individuals and companies, and I think there's a real fallacy, if this is okay to say, it's quite controversial probably, but I don't think we can ask companies to be nice. If you as a company are nice and your rivals aren't, sooner or later, they will outcompete you, they'll receive the investment, they can undercut you on price or whatever. And I think the asking individuals to do stuff is really a way of shifting responsibility, because the reality is, banning drinking straws may or may not be a nice thing, and it reduce a little bit the pollution in the oceans, but it ain't going to stop that 6 meters. That 6 meters comes when we shift, for example, our energy system fundamentally from burning fossil fuels to electrification and make as much of that electricity as possible for renewable sources. There's a few other major things we can do, but that's basically what we have to do. And that requires governments. And our government, European governments in particular, and a peer of the US government, we're real leaders in kind of policies that, for example, subsidize renewables in the early days. While China was building coal power stations, we were proud we were building some wind farms. But I think now the investments we made that enabled that renewable industry, solar and wind and stuff like that in the early days, is totally and utterly swamped by the astonishing technical progress made in China. So to give you ideas on this, solar panels are currently 50 times cheaper than they were 20 years ago, right? They've halved in price over the last 18 months. That curve has not stopped. Batteries are 10 times cheaper than they were 12 years ago, although they halved this year, so that's really 20 times cheaper, and they're going to halve again over the next couple of years. They're 60 times less likely to catch fire than a petrol car, because guess what? Petrol's pretty flammable as well. You'll see stuff about the use of cobalt in the battery supply chain. Cobalt's also used in oil refining, right? In fact, if you look at the environmental damage caused by the oil industry, it's pretty colossal. So why do you only see stories now about the stuff done by batteries? And I think, the one thing I'd ask of investors and companies is to be honest, because you'll make perfectly good returns, but you better look your kids in the eyes.
Okay, so be honest.
Yeah, be honest in the background. Look, there's plenty of rules about being honest in advertising, but be honest in the background, because you'll do perfectly well, right? All the CEOs will have moved on and retired and done perfectly well, right? All the investors will get the returns they need, but they won't leave behind quite such a trash planet.
But yes, I agree. But you also said, gosh, governments have a role, and it seems like China's on it. But you went to the dinner with Trump, I think. What did you tell him? What would you tell him?
Well, first of all, I can say he seemed perfectly healthy. His hands were fine. But I mean, that was actually the dinner where I had the conversation with the oil CEO. And actually, the bit I missed out of this was actually ending up having a blazing row with him at the table about this topic.
The CEO or Trump?
The CEO. No, Trump was too far away and had a lot of security people. But but with the oil CEO, because the oil industry were fairly cock a hoop about Trump statements. Very briefly, you're interested. I mean, the last thing on this. I mean, you got so many once. It may not be the last thing. But people say to me, look, the US is playing to its strengths. It's got oil and gas reserves. So it's entirely rational to do drill, baby, drill. Meanwhile, China's playing to its strengths. It doesn't have oil and gas reserves, and therefore it's having to electrify. But the difference is that the technologies of the fossil fuel industry are mature. They're not going to advance much, while the technology of electrification are improving exponentially. So if today they're roughly on a par in cost or performance, broadly speaking, in a decade, those companies that have electrified and invested in those technologies will be way ahead, way exponentially ahead of those that have tried to go backwards. And I think the crying tragedy, you can actually see a world in which our addiction to the incumbent industries of fossil fuels, because it's not just the oil and gas companies, it's car companies, like BMW and stuff like that, have not covered themselves in glory here. And I think that addiction to the world they're in could mean that we end up looking like middle-income countries.
And whereas China?
Yeah, and look, I don't say I have any love for China. It's got all kinds of things that we don't like. But you can't deny the technology progress, particularly in this space. I'm not saying it's because they're nice people, but these are the facts of what's going on in energy.
So
by the way, you should say, China's exports of clean energy last year were 20% higher than the US exports of oil and gas. This year, so far, China's exports of clean energy technologies 50% higher than the US's exports of oil and gas. That's what I talk about exponential. And when China's exporting these technologies, they're capital products. Like you buy a solar panel from China, you've got 20 years of energy. You buy oil from the US, you've got, as soon as you burn it, it's gone.
Yeah. Now that's really interesting. So obviously at CMI, we're all about management and leadership. So what is it about the way the management and leadership in China or anywhere that's adopting this and accelerating this? What are the principles that they're using, the behaviors that they're championing versus the behaviors that are holding us back in management and leadership terms? What do you see as the difference?
I think, first of all, look, I'm not saying I have any love for China. Let's be really, really clear. But there is, in fact, frankly, there's a challenge in democracy, which is everyone's much more short term. So China set its 2030 goals in 2019. It delivered them in 2024 because they're relentlessly able to control a lot more than we can and take a longer term view. It was in the early 2000s, I think, maybe 2010, that they realized that they could never compete against the West on petrol cars. The technology was too mature, the companies were too good. And they just looked at what's going to come next and fostered an electric car industry. The interesting thing, and I think the big learning though, is the extent of competition. So we all hear about Chinese oversupply. The companies will never make any money. They'll all go bust. All this stuff. What happens is the Chinese government will foster a sector for maybe 5 years, and then it withdraws the support and lets them fight like animals for the future. And the competition is called involution. The competition between Chinese companies. For example, there's about 120 car companies, right? And so in the West, we'll go, but only, the Western incumbents will say, no, 100 of them are going to go bust. And it's like, that's fine, but the 20 that survive are going to be unbelievably fit. And I think that relentless competition is something that, I remember at P&G how fiercely we competed against a handful of rivals. Like whatever brand you were on, you knew who your rivals were and you competed like mad. And I think we need more of that in our economy and more of that in our leadership.
So like detergent wars where one CEO holds up the washing powder, a washed garment, the Ariel garment with no holes, and the Persil garment with holes. You mean that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, whatever is going to win in your market. And I think that's something that we generally don't have enough of.
Okay, but how do you square that relentless competitive streak with creating a culture where people feel, family dinnerish.
Yeah, so you don't be competitive in the company. Right? So we're competitive against that, right? It's quite funny then, our sector, quite often politics are, I wish you guys wouldn't squabble so much. Like, you want us to disagree, right? That's what you want in a sector. And loads of it, like people often say, look, when it comes to climate, all you companies should work together. I'm like, no, my job is to destroy those companies. We're fiercely competitive. It's something P&G was amazing at. It's why it hired so many sports captains and stuff like that. But I think that internally, for us, the last thing I want, it's really interesting. One of the things that I was terrible in any big company. I can't do corporate politics. And an interesting thing about creating your own company is, first of all, I personally am fairly free, I hope, but you can spot it and create a culture that doesn't reward it. And I want people who are relentlessly focused on delivering value for customers and knowing that if one of them gets a success, we've all won. So in fact, every employee is a shareholder. They don't buy the shares; you get equity when you join, and I think that creates incredible. There's very, very little in the way of bonuses and stuff like that. Very little in the way of individual KPIs, because what you really want is people that are focused on the big picture, which is building real value with what we do for customers.
Okay, so you reward everybody in Octopus on what? Customer NPS, satisfaction scores, the results in the whole company?
No, I mean, it's really interesting. And what we have then is every year everyone gets an inflation-linked pay rise. There's a formula. So it's on the anniversary of you starting. So you don't need to have an annual kind of pay rise round. It will just happen automatically. Everyone's got equity, so if we do well, we don't need to create a formula. It's just if the company does well, you do well. And then, if you get promotion or take on more responsibility, then we'll have a chat about pay. But that's it. There's no KPIs, no what counts factors, no kind of process. Promoted? Yeah, so again, it's disseminated to the team. So in our world where we don't have an HR department, if you're running a team, your job is to make that team as successful as possible. If your manager spots you've done well, then they may give you extra responsibilities, ask you to do more. If you're not doing so well, if your manager doesn't think you're doing so well, you won't.
Okay, but that sounds quite subjective.
Yeah, but I mean, so it's so funny. Like, all these processes are subjective. You might as well be honest about it, right? And I think honestly, all this false objective, it's really interesting. We're the only unicorn, I think, in the UK with a negative gender pay gap, which means women earn more, right? And yet we've never had a target on that. And I think it comes from creating a very strong culture where you can be yourself, and where we seek out, like, part of the way we train and create the culture is seek out what people are really good at and give them more of it.
Play to strength.
Yeah, that's something I learned at P&G. And actually, and to the extent possible, don't worry about the weaknesses. Give those to someone else.
Yeah. And we agree with you. And the old P&G adage of, well, here's your development opportunity, and nobody ever fixed those. But you play to people's strengths.
But also, you'd always go like, what are the two most important? They're all the same. You go, no, the two most important are, thinking and problem solving, and I can't remember the other one. Leadership and was it? Anyway, so everyone would go and lobby that, I'm really good at thinking and problem solving. And it's like, okay, so rather than having those kind of, charades, it's better genuinely just decentralize all this. And we'll get it wrong in some places. And people will bubble that up and we'll typically be able to sort it out. But in many ways, it's like really interesting. We've got this huge problem as a species that if something goes wrong, we overreact, rather than spotting the number of things that have gone right because we took that risk in the first place.
So I'm going to ask you about failure. What's your attitude then toward failure? Yeah,
I think, first of all, we want to innovate as a company. You never know what's going to work and what's not. So that means that if everyone in good heart is taking on, responsible for innovating, loads of it's going to fail. So the last thing you do is punish someone who was brave enough to take on an innovation. But it's really interesting. Years and years ago, I sat on the sort of advisory board for the innovation unit of a very large company, and people in the company would put forward their ideas, and the winners would come and pitch to this board, and then we'd give them the feedback, and they go. And it took literally a year or two of going back and forward and giving like wise feedback before anyone could do anything. And what it meant is once they've fought that hard to make something happen, they're never going to admit it's failed. If you let people innovate without really asking for permission, they can also let it fail without anyone really noticing. And I think reducing that psychological cost of failure, reducing the incentive for people to keep telling you something is working when it's patently not, is really powerful. And back to the decentralization, you talked about how promotions work, right? It's very similar on these. If someone's innovated something and it's working, they can come and ask for more budget. If they've innovated something that's not working, then it won't get more budget.
So win big, fail cheap.
Yeah, that's
Another
genuine. Yeah.
PNG-ism, actually.
Is it really? Well, that's genuine. Though. We've got a couple of huge businesses we've built now that started in that way, and you know, I think that allowing people to fail without really making a fuss about it is hugely important.
Yeah. Okay. Now I have to ask you about the other big watchword on everybody's lips: AI. What's AI going to do to the way we work, to your culture, to the world at large? How we manage and lead? What are your thoughts?
So, we haven't talked about technology much, and it's interesting. But between P&G and Octopus, you know, one of the biggest, two of the big businesses that I and my co-founders built were in technology, and we built technology platforms and helped large companies. We introduced new technologies to large companies, and really, what we found was it always under-delivered. When we looked at why, it's because you're always adding to a messy software stack. And so we kind of identify that what you really need to, at some point, you need to be brave enough to get rid of all your existing software, legacy stuff, and move on to something new. And we tried to persuade large energy companies of this idea, and none of them would do it. They said, like, someone's got to do it first.
This is cracking.
Yeah, well, so this before we started the company, and we said someone's got to do it first. We actually built Octopus partly as the demo client to show what you can do. And it was, you know, once we'd got a few million customers, other large energy companies started wanting to license Kraken from us, the software. But Kraken was always built on this idea that in most companies, all your data is siloized. Each function's got its own systems, often multiple ones. Your team spend loads of time moving it around, and it makes everything difficult from marketing to customer service to finance and operations. By putting all the data in one place and having it all kind of according to a unified data model, what it meant was not only could we run the business much more efficiently, but we were really well placed when LLMs came along. And I remember in November, I think, of 2022, a techie mate of mine invited me onto an SMS chat group. And it turned out one of the participants was ChatGPT, and that was my first experience. And just like that moment, we all remember how we first got there. When you first saw you could talk to a computer, and it was like really clever. And I shared it with our head of data science, and he said, we've been experimenting with this, and he showed me a demo of ChatGPT for customer service. And it was mind-blowing. We had a CEOs meeting of all our global CEOs, and we showed them it, and honestly, the room went silent. And so we decided we were going to put a lot of effort in. It was in the middle of the energy crisis, and we were getting twice as many calls from customers as usual. They were lasting twice as long. It's really difficult. And so we thought, like, could we use this to improve customer service? Because we couldn't recruit fast enough, and it wouldn't be economically viable. And so I think in February of 2023, we started using it in customer service. And every week in our management meeting, I was like, how's this going? And the team were like, yeah, it's going quite well. We're doing 5% of the stuff, you know. And I said, well, that's not going to make a difference. So I'm still making mistakes. And then I remember one of them, it was like, look, how many mistakes is it making? And they said, well, the people are getting, our team, who are brilliant, get a 58% satisfaction rate from customers. And the AI is getting 68%. And I was like, let the AI loose. And so overnight, we went to like 45% of all our customer communications, emails, to customer service emails. So we did 250,000 a week. 45% went straight to AI. And we were scared, actually. The biggest thing we were feared about was introducing it to the team, because we thought they'd all worry about their jobs. And instead, they loved it because it dramatically reduced the tedious jobs. And when you've got a customer's got a problem with their bills, right? So you have to look at their billing history, their statement history, the communications history, a ton of stuff to try and work out what's happened. And then you have to try and type along. It does all that for them. And so actually it was like a superpower. And it really did enable us to enable our team to give better service in the hardest of times. We found it's top.
Did you lay any of the customer service people off?
No, I mean, we're a growing company. I think, and being very candid, I genuinely don't know what would happen if we weren't growing customer numbers. Okay. And also growing new services, so that we've always had places to put people. it's quite hard to read the impact on productivity. But definitively, in fact, yeah, I can tell you actually, people who are new into the workplace are using it a lot more than ones that weren't. And so if we look at the usage rates, newer and newer team members are really using it a lot. It's been tremendous fun. I mean, I'll tell you one of the great things we did. It was at one point, it came from one of our management meetings that the AI had invented a new product, it hallucinated a product, and sold it to a customer. All right. And because the AI learns all the time, like every email it sends, it's learning from. It then sold it to another 22 customers before we caught it. And people always worry about this because we're a regulated sector. But the reality is the AI has made fewer mistakes than people, and all that. So in the big picture, I didn't worry about it. But what it taught us was we've always got a human in the loop. So every email, well, there are now 4% we do automatically, but every email now basically has a human checking it, tweaking it if they want, and then signing off. 23 of them.
Good, though.
Well, 23 of these hallucinations that escaped before it was caught by one of our team. It's because the team started trusting the robot more than themselves, and they assumed the robot knew what it was doing. Right. So I think we're still in these very, very early days. I think the relentless use of in our company, for example, one thing we've got is every wind farm and solar farm we have is it's an SPV, a separate company. And so we've got 140 separate companies just doing that. And everyone has got a stack of legal documents that's similar but different. And we've reduced the use of external lawyers by 90% because the AI is very, very good at handling these kind of similar-ish documents. And I think you're seeing pockets of everything. In fact, one of my favorites was our operations director, in charge of like 10 million people's worth of operations and 20 billion pounds worth. Was going on a ride-along with one of our engineers, and there's a process after they've installed some in people's homes where there's a load of leftover bits. And on average, there's a few £100 of leftover bits of copper and screws and all this stuff. And so in order to cut down on the waste, we'd create these forms that the engineers fill out to say what's left. And we saw that filling out the form was so tedious. It would take the engineer 2 or 3 hours, so they just didn't do it. Yeah. And so over a weekend, our operations director, who'd never coded, he vibe coded a thing where you... an app where you take a photo of all the leftovers, it would analyze what's there, like 4 of these screws, 2 of these pipes, whatever, and create a document that could just be uploaded straight into our systems, into Kraken. And it turned that engineer job from being a few hours to like 10, 15 minutes. And of course, it's not necessarily production ready, but it's 80% of the way there. So a developer can take that, and they've now got a perfect prototype. Normally we spend our time writing specs, and they're terrible. No business people can write good specs. No developers know what you really want. You waste so much time going back and forth. And here, instead of a spec, you've got a prototype, which, by the way, can be transmogrified into the real thing. And I think that's happening more and more now, and that's really interesting.
So that sounds like great use cases. Well, I know we've got to get you whisked away, and although that board is no longer sharing the time, we don't have much left, and I really want you guys to ask questions.
By the way, can I say one thing? If any of this has sounded slightly braggy, there was something really interesting working for Procter & Gamble as an American company. You learn in a business setting not to be a humble Brit, right? So
that's important.
Yeah, well, it may or may not be, but it means, honestly, if any of this sounds like I'm being a little bit boastful, I'm really, really sorry, but it is a P&G problem, right? Well, yeah. or opportunity or benefit or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's a P&G thing.
Know your own strengths and don't be afraid.
Yeah, don't be afraid. Yeah.
So don't be afraid. Ask him a question. Who wants to start? The hand in the middle there, and then the hand toward the front. We have a roving mic.
Hi, wonderful conversation. My name's Lavelda Vincenzi. I was really intrigued by what you said about the negative pay gap, and it's been something that companies for decades have been working with. What do you think was the octopus secret that meant that you were able to create a negative pay gap where large organizations have struggled, despite putting a ton of different processes in place, to move the needle significantly?
So honestly, I don't know how replicable it is, but I can say that we have no processes in place for it. What we do have is a massively strong culture, and there's an analogy I use, right, which is, I think in most organizations, the way that people are managed and teams are built is very much like a brick wall. So you kind of have a bunch of characteristics you want in an employee, or a bunch of responsibilities they're going to have, and be 8 responsibilities, and then you rigidly give them those 8 responsibilities, and then you stack all of your kind of people according to the precise responsibility you've set for each job, measure them by the KPIs, and glue them together with an HR department. That's the mortar in the wall. And instead, we do something we call the dry stone wall, which is when you're building dry stone walls, the walls that with lots of different shaped rocks. And when you're building a dry stone wall, you pick a rock up and you kind of try and work out roughly where it will fit best according to the shape it actually is. And so the interesting thing about dry stone walls is the oldest ones in the world are thousands of years old because they're able to move with the landscape. They don't rely on the mortar to stick together, which means brick walls fall down quite quickly because you get water penetration, it freezes, and it's too rigid. Now, I think that approach of the dry stone wall that says every person is a different shape. So when we're bringing someone to the organization or moving them around within it, you're looking at what is their real shape and then building the machine around them. And you know what? It's really interesting. Sometimes entire parts of our company have been built because of the specific individuals. So we haven't said we want to build a company, build something that does this, therefore we'll define these roles and then get the best fit. We literally say, look at this great team of people here. If we give them some more resources and point them in that direction, they'll create something magical because of who and what they are. Now, that bit about who and what they are, I think applies, for example, in things like gender. Because, if you're looking at someone for who and what they are, then regardless of whether they're male or female, and regardless of different life events, you're looking for what is the magic in this person, and then how do we build around that? Now, I'm not saying that will always create a negative gender pay gap, but I think it will generally create a naturally more evenly distributed reward pool.
Yeah, and people will play to their strengths, and because women naturally have quite a few strengths, they end up getting paid more.
Yeah,
and it's more and it's more organic because they're not conforming to the norm of. And
it's a lot easier to manage. It's a lot easier to manage someone where you've identified they've got. I mean, we don't write down, but let's say they've got 6 strengths, and they're the 6 that you expect them to do. Than it is to manage someone who's got 5 strengths. There are 9 strengths you want. They've got 5 of them, and they're weak in 4 areas. That's hard to manage. It's miles easier just to kind of create the jobs that precisely fit the people, not the other way around.
Excellent. Really interesting answer. Now, there was a hand toward the front, and then we'll go to the back.
There's a lot of people in the room who've got over 30 years at P&G here. So what did P&G leadership do wrong to lose somebody as entrepreneurial as you?
Yeah, I don't think P&G leadership did anything wrong. I mean, look, if I'm really honest about it, and forgive me for this, I think I had a slightly dickish attitude at the beginning, as many new starts do, by the way, which was I kind of thought, I'll go and work here and get some experience, and then go do something else. Interesting, I'd only ever intended to stay for 2 years, and it was so addictive, I stayed for 4. And so I generally don't think P&G did anything wrong. In fact, I can't tell you how many people from P&G I work with in a variety of ways. In fact, when we started Octopus, I actually simultaneously co-founded a business that Jane worked in for a while with another P&G alumnus that we literally started at the same time. And then simultaneously back to another P&G alumnus who is technically a serial entrepreneur because his business makes breakfast cereals. And then you've got Robert Diamond there as a brilliant entrepreneur. And I think, honestly, that I think that P&G kind of gathers talent, some of which is right to stay. And honestly, I was not particularly good at P&G either, because
you made those mistakes on that Pantene copy.
That was one of my greatest achievements. Anyway, no, but so I hope that makes sense, though. It's like, with our company, I don't want everyone to be an entrepreneur because it would be chaos. And it's genuinely like, I think it takes a mixture of talents to build anything. But the deepest respect for P&G. And for example, Gavin Patterson, who was he was my mate's boss, and I wished he was mine, is chairman of one of our group businesses now. And so you still have a lot of connections. And from this conversation, I've taken a lot of respect for the values. And the values were everything. Yeah, I think that comes through. Guy in the back, and then the one in the front.
I'd just like to suggest, based on what you've said, that also what you do as an organization that's quite impressive is you talked about us as a company and all your staff and your mission and everything else, but you have the same approach to your customers. And a lot of companies have us and them, but the way that you tend to behave seems to be a lot more like us and us. And I'm speaking on behalf of myself as a customer, but actually my 93-year-old mother, where with most other companies, you have this whole churn. You talked about the loyalty. How do I get the best price? I have to leave to get the best price. But also, it's their money. And a lot of customers have huge banks of money with big utility companies, phones and everybody. You make it easy for them to say, actually, you're building up a bit of a reserve there. Can I have some of my money back? So you're treating people with openness and honesty about their money, not only your money. And I think that's quite an important value that you transmit.
So that's great. That's not a question, but you had a question. In
there is one quick comment on that, which was, first of all, I was taught something right at the beginning by a customer, which was the very first ad we did on Facebook. It was all about how lovely and cuddly we were. And the customer wrote, and I'm just quoting this, there's no judgment attached to it. She wrote, "Yous are ripping us all off." And the interesting bit was learning that in a social media world, you couldn't just broadcast at people. They were going to talk back and realize that if we listened to that and embraced it, we would learn so much more. And ultimately, that went very, very well with culture I talked about earlier. People can be themselves. And so our customer operations team is like, the customer service team, is like, they make their own decisions on every single thing they do with the customer. And I think that genuinely is like, everyone in the company is built around that kind of philosophy. So it's not totally, I'm really proud of it. And I'm so glad that's your experience. But there was actually some learning on the way, quite brutal learning that helped inform it.
But that's another example of finding an opportunity in a negative. So you had a question right here, and then we'll have this, and then that's it. Then you really need to get whisked away.
Thank you. And thank you, Greg. And then I'm Matthew Law. And maybe a bit selfish and ask two questions. So the first one is
very, very short.
At least you're honest. Yeah.
What are your absolute non-negotiables in daily life and in business? And the second one is, without getting overly politicalized, but you mentioned from crisis there's transformation opportunities. So is there any practical advice you can maybe give the government, and that will hopefully benefit a bit more on everyone?
Okay, so first of all, on the non-negotiable is integrity. I once started a business with someone who turned out to be what I can only call a wrong-un, and I hadn't realised. And the damage it did, to people around him was brutal. And in fact, the next time I started a business, I phoned up people I'd known since I was at university to say, because I knew they had more integrity than anyone else, and we're going to start that. And that's since then, like, I can't tell you the importance of it. And people think they can work around. There's someone who's brilliantly talented but doesn't have integrity. You can't work around it. It's toxic. And anyway, there we go. I think in terms of a crisis and opportunity for the current government, I think there's a recognition in society that things are a bit screwed up. And I think if you accept that, and you literally, I think at some point, of course, governments always have resets, but I don't think they really mean it. And I think if you really mean it, you'd be very candid, and you say, look, we have a world where now. I'll give you an example. I keep seeing in social media people that complain about crime and they link it to all kinds of social stuff. Simultaneously, I see the same people complaining about ID cards or CCTV or whatever. And it's like, look, genuinely, you can't have both. And we've got to be honest. And I think if we can say to people, look, there's an incredible amount of dissatisfaction at the moment. But if we're all just against everything, no one's going to be happy. We've now got to start making, like, each individual, I want to look you in the eyes and say, you can't have both of these things. So let's talk about which we're going to have and be grown up. And I honestly think the fallout from our social media world of anger, fostering hatred everywhere, at some point you reverse that. And I just wish we had a, leadership that could do it.
But really what you're saying, because I see you have got to go, and I'm so sorry we didn't get to your question.
Oh, shit, yeah. Let's do that question really quick. Let's just do it really quick. Which one was it? Yeah.
So at the inception, how did you foster a warm culture? How did you At the inception, how did you foster a born global firm of hiring and training for exponential growth, looking at culture over strategy?
Yeah, look, I think the interesting thing, if you've ever started a business, you look back, I can't really remember how we did it. And that's really because I set a vision. I go, look, in principle, it looks like we can do this. And then you gather a group of talented people and they build it, right? They're with you. I mean, I'm not saying this is a black box. It's quite the opposite. But you're fostering that from the very beginning. I think it's very much like a seed is replicating its DNA as it grows and ultimately creates a tree. And you've got to create that DNA. And that is what will expand. If you look at almost any major tech business that's like famously founder-led, it is the DNA of that founder. So Apple is just Steve Jobs' DNA grown large. You know, same with Microsoft, the same with Oracle. If you know the founder, if you see the company, you know the founder and you're right. I think that's what matters. And forgive me, I'm going to...
Yes,
Well,
okay.
thank
Greg,
you.
thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you.